Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Den of Sin with Devin and James. I'm Devin, and I'm here with my my good friend since high school, James. What are you calling them out there? Cinemaniacs?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if that's going to stick, but I figured it. I thought of it a spur of the moment, so I don't know. There might even be other things labeled such a thing, but I think it's. I mean, I guess we can leave it up to our listeners. Do you want to be called Cinemaniacs? Do you think that's
Yeah, I think that's fair. Let us know on Twitter or Facebook if you find us Den of Sin, spelled CIN, and let us know what you want to be called. But until then, we're going to call you Cinemaniacs, whether you like it or not.
Exactly.
So, James, we are back in our seats here in very short time because we unexpectedly hit a two-parter again, our second two-parter in a row.
Was not the intention.
No, but, the subject is Canon Film Group, and with a particular attention to the films they made in the 1980s under the Golan Globus leadership. And there's just so much to talk about during that period. They were releasing, I have the number here. Yes, in 1986, they reached 43 films in 1 year. To put that in another way, that's almost a movie every week. And we'll get into a little bit of the peak and the downfall of Canon was happening simultaneously. And part of it is because of that output.
That's right.
And we'll get into some of that as we go on. There were a couple of things I wanted to mention before we got too far in, though. I wanted to mention last time, I didn't get around to it, so it was a good thing that we have a second episode because it definitely deserves a shout out. But in the process of researching Canon, I, of course, started with the movie that you mentioned, the documentary, which is called The Electric Boogaloo, The Wild Untold Story of Canon Films. And you can find it to stream. I think it's out of print on DVD, but there is a Blu-ray of it. And it's definitely worth your time. I also discovered in my research, there's a podcast called The Canon, which is two guys who... They performed and taught with the Upright Citizens Brigade. And so these are two really funny guys, and they do kind of a similar thing to us, but they do it a lot funnier because they're from the Upright Citizens Brigade. And honestly, if I knew this podcast was out there, they're so good, I probably would have been too insecure to mention this as a topic. But I've gotten a lot of enjoyment out of it, and their names are Frank Garcia Hale and Jeff Garlock, and the name of the show is The Canon. So when you're done with this, they deep dive into the individual Canon movies that we're discussing here. So if you don't hear your favorite movie mentioned here, or if you do hear your favorite movie mentioned and you want to know more about it than we have time to give, head over to the Canon because each one is a single movie, dedicated to a single movie, and they do a really great job of. So I wanted to put that out there.
I'll have to check that out.
Now, I mentioned on the way out last time that I was going to try to watch 10 to Midnight, starring Charles Bronson. Did you ever get around to that one?
No, this has been a pretty insane week for me. All things considered, much busier than I thought it was going to be for me. So no, I barely had enough time to brush my teeth. But I figured this week I'll probably get around to it, and then we can touch upon it on our next recording. I'm assuming you watched it because that's who you are. That's what you do.
I did watch it. I'll confess I kind of watched it with one eye.
Okay.
Just working on some other things. I can say I'd be interested in your take on it, actually, because it has elements of a slasher movie, but it's also a police story. Charles Bronson is a cop in this one instead of a unchecked vigilante, but that doesn't keep him from behaving as if he's a vigilante. And if you thought that Dirty Harry was out there in terms of what a police officer should or shouldn't do in the line of business there, what Bronson does in 10 to Midnight makes Dirty Harry look like all gray area ethically.
Well, that's all you need to say.
Yeah.
Charles Bronson is very much, every character he portrays. I mean, he's not known specifically for nuanced ethics or morally ambiguous characters. He usually plays characters that are sort of, they've decided, like, not a lot, at least, in the films that come to mind immediately, not a lot of Charles Bronson roles where he's conflicted over his decisions. So,
he says it.
He's usually pretty, he makes up his mind. Exactly.
In this film, he's talking to another, I believe it's the coroner or something, and the coroner was saying, we found no evidence on the body that she was violated prior to death. And Bronson says, I could have told you that. His knife is his penis. And I'm just like, that's Charles Bronson just says it. He says the quiet parts out loud. Just like in Murphy's Law, someone's explaining to him what Murphy's Law is, which is, anything that can go wrong will go wrong. And he says, well, I don't know about that, but in my world, there's only one Murphy's Law. Don't fuck with Jack Murphy. Nothing but class, that Bronson. And he's actually a legitimately, I won't say great, legitimately good actor. So I still stand by my prior statement, though, that Cannon made the best Chuck Norris movies and the worst Charles Bronson.
Yeah, I would be hard-pressed to argue against that point. So
now, when we were going through the Cannon movies leading up to this, James, did you notice how many, kind of for lack of a better term, elite Cannon movies there were? Like movies where Golan and Globus went after some really incredible kind of art house filmmakers to make their movies with?
Yeah, it's funny because that's not when I think of the films of Cannon, that's not necessarily what I think of them for. So it is a weird little corner of their filmography. But yeah, it is. I think it would be surprising for most people who know of their output being more of the action-oriented, horror-oriented stuff that they did. But I'm not too familiar with the films themselves, though. They work with great directors and directors I admire and directors I'm a fan of. Those I've actually seen from Cannon. Yeah,
there are some good directors that continue to work with Cannon that did a few things. But I did want to just give some lip service here to these films. Menachem Golem especially, who is, as we said before, was a writer and director himself and directed several of the Cannon films. They had a really solid reputation for being confirmed movie nerds. And people loved to talk to them about movies. And that was kind of the thrill of working with Cannon for a lot of people, was that they get to go off and make movies with people that loved movies. So he was anxious to work with some of the elite in the business as well. And as you said, that's not really what they're known for. And that's not what this podcast is going to be about as a result, because I really do think that this is, Chuck Norris's time to shine. And there's really not going to be much other time to bring up Van Damme at this extensive level. So just to give kind of a quick listing, just to let you know the diversity of the Cannon group, they did That Champion Season, which was written and directed by Jason Miller, starring Robert Mitchum. Love Streams, which was John Cassavetes. Fool for Love, which is Robert Altman. Barfly, which is a Mickey Rourke film about Charles Bukowski. Yes, directed by Barbette Schroeder. Tough Guys Don't Dance, written and directed by Norman Mailer, who most people probably know more as an author than a director. And they did King Lear with Jean-Luc Godard, which featured Woody Allen. So Woody Allen's actually in a Cannon film. And they made Pirates with Roman Polanski, which I don't know if you ever saw Pirates.
I've not. No, in fact, I'm curious about it.
It's on YouTube if you're really curious. I have serious doubts that it will ever be widely available. It was one of those video boxes as a kid. I grew up really wanting to see the movie. I don't know why I never got it. I think I remember my dad telling me it was a bad movie, and that was why I didn't get it. But realizing when I got older that the pirate on the cover was Walter Matthau just made me want to see it more, to see Walter Matthau as a wild, bearded pirate with a peg leg. And it's directed by Roman Polanski. It sounds like all the elements are there, but they're not. It's incredibly boring and unfunny. It's supposed to be a comedy, and it was one of the first movies that Polanski wrote after his trouble in the United States. And it was not, if he was trying to fix anything about a bad reputation at that time, Pirates was not the one to do it. It's very problematic in that sense. Probably the most problematic of all of Polanski's movies, possibly more problematic than most of Polanski's movies, just based on some of the things that he goes for to get jokes in here involving assault. So just to put it out there, probably not worth tracking down Pirates.
Good. And is it, I've seen the poster art. I know it's Polanski, but I don't know really anything about the film specifically. Is it literally just about pirates?
It's about a pirate, and I don't know, I guess it's his assistant who, Matthau is the lead pirate. When he originally wrote it, when Polanski originally wrote it, it was for Jack Nicholson, and he was going to play the assistant himself because he was still kind of baby-faced enough to do so. He couldn't get it made right away because of the problems that he had, and he ran off to Europe, as we all know, and he finally got it off the ground there, barely off the ground. And it's definitely a comedy. It's definitely him trying to create a action romp. Polanski himself has said that it was inspired by Pirates of the Caribbean. So in theory, it should be on the level at least as Gore Verbinski's Johnny Depp movie. It's just not. They're lost at sea on a small boat, Mathau and his assistant, or cabin boy or whatever. And they you know what? It's not even, we have so much to talk about. I'm just going to call it here.
Not worth it.
I will say this.
I think it's good.
It doesn't bode well for the film when Walter Matthau, who rarely does publicity for a film in the first place, was doing publicity for this film saying, I've never been in a script that I understood less. That
all
was
right,
his
well, I think
publicity for this.
I think that's all that needs to be said then, I guess.
But to dovetail off of the elite movies, though, there are a couple of sort of elite movies that do fit into the canon style. One I would say is 52 Pickup, which was directed by John Frankenheimer and written by Elmore Leonard, and stars Roy Scheider, who's always great, and his wife is played by Anne Margaret, and the bad guy is played by John Glover. And I don't know if you're a fan of John Glover. For those who don't know him, yeah, he was kind of typecast in the 80s as an obnoxious yuppie in things like Scrooged and Gremlins 2, The New Batch. He's fantastic in this. Everyone should see 52 Pickup. That's maybe the undiscovered classic of this episode. It's not a perfect film, but Ray Scheider is always compelling enough, and John Glover's villain's actually what sells it for me. And then another one that came out about the same time and actually landed Cannon some Oscar nominations was Runaway Train, from a script by Akira Kurosawa, of all people.
Which is still insane.
Now, you saw Runaway Train, right, James?
Yeah, I saw. I think this is going to be a reoccurring statement on this podcast, but I'm pretty sure I might have saw it with you, or I might have saw it with Ben. But yeah, I think I saw it in my very late 20s for the first time. I probably haven't seen it in almost since my very late 20s, but I think there was a point, I think, where I don't know if it might not have been you, but sounds like it was you, where we were watching every Eric Roberts movie. Like every night of the week, there was an Eric Roberts movie.
That sounds like me. I don't remember. I don't think I saw Runaway Train, though, until, well, I guess late 20s. So maybe it was you and I. Probably would have been Ben's idea.
I say it might have been either Ben or, I know at one point our friend Casey was very, very into Eric Roberts. So it might have also been Casey with Casey. It's funny, those days were, I will say, I look very, I mean, this podcast exists because of how fondly I look back on those days of just hanging out and, talking about movies, watching movies. But a lot of that stuff doesn't exactly, the scenario didn't mesh well with a strong memory. So, for multiple reasons. So, but I mean, my facts could be wrong, but it was definitely, I felt like it was one of you guys. I also have a love-hate relationship with Jon Voight.
Yeah, big time.
Because he's a talented actor when he wants to be. He's capable of being a talented actor, but he doesn't always pull it off. But yeah. Jon
Voight and Eric Roberts were both nominated for Oscars for this movie, which makes me think, I didn't look at the other nominees, but it makes me think as good as this movie is, as much as I enjoy it, going back and rewatching it makes me think that 1985 must have been a pretty slow year, because I don't think that these are Oscar nomination worthy performances. They're so hammy, they're so over the top, which is the charm, which is why I enjoy these performances, but I don't chalk them up as like Oscar material. I can't tell where any of them are from. They're both using accents, and Eric Roberts is playing Matthew McConaughey playing Forrest Gump in this movie. I need my shoes. And I
will say this, it was weird because there was a time in my life when I remember Eric Roberts being considered a legitimate actor.
No, he was. He was a good actor.
That's what's weird.
I can list off, some Sidney Lumet movies. Star 80 was good. There were several things he did right around this period that were Oscar worthy. And he's, again, not bad in this, but that accent is so all over the place. I can't tell if he's deep Southern or if he's trying to play of mice and men sort of scenario with Voight escaping from prison. And Voight's just chewing it up. He's just gruff Voight in a part that apparently Marlon Brando really loved him in this part. Wrote about him in his autobiography in Runaway Train. But it's a really tense script. These guys, they escape from a maximum security prison and they hop on a train to try to get away. The movie's not actually much about the prison break. That's just kind of the first act. Although it starts off with John Voight has been sealed in solitary for years. Like, not just locked up. They sealed him with a soldering gun into solitary confinement for like 3 years. And now he's out. And they jump on this train, and the conductor dies, and the train keeps going. And it's through the Alaskan wilderness, and it just keeps on picking up speed. And then there's these intercuts with scenes in the control center for the trains that are very reminiscent of Taking of Pelham 1, 2, 3, but a little less dynamic than that. And then cutting back to the train where you have these two escaped convicts, and Rebecca De Mornay is a railroad worker who happens to be on the train as well, trying to figure out how to stay alive while at the same time not getting caught. Because they can't be rescued in a traditional way if they're prison convicts.
That's right. Yeah.
And it also features the first ever appearances of Tiny Lister and Danny Trejo.
Yep.
Runaway Train's one of those ones that everyone should probably see Runaway Train at some point. If you're interested in filmmaking, it's really tight action.
I need to rewatch it. That's the thing is, that revisiting these lists or whatever, it's like, there's a lot of time when you see a movie and there's, hundreds of movies where I'll watch a film and I'll be like, oh, I really like that. And then I move on to another film and other things. And I don't go around to revisiting for one reason or another. A lot of the time, especially with movies these days, like they're harder to come by. You can't just pop into your local rental video store and rent it. And everything is streaming now. So sometimes these films are a little harder to find. I remember enjoying it. There's something about even that I'm blanking on the name of the film, but there was the Denzel Washington film that's also about a runaway train.
This was just a couple of years ago, right?
Yeah, about 5 or 6 years ago. And I like that too. I like both versions of the Taking of Pelham 1, 2, 3, 4, but Taking of Pelham 1, 2, 3. Obviously, the original's better, but I enjoyed the remake enough. But yeah, there's something about that concept that's, you have, because the sheer size and weight of Runaway Train. There's how do you stop that? And it's already it's a tense it's a great plot device for a film to add in a lot of tension on top of your action and stuff. So it works in that. I'll need to revisit it though, like I said, because it's not super fresh in my brain. I don't specifically remember Eric Roberts' accent. So I don't have anything to say about that, but I do remember him being very Eric Roberts-y in it. And if you know Eric Roberts, you know what I mean. Weirdly angsty. But yeah, that's the thing I liked about mid-'80s canon is they were doing a lot of different, they were taking chances. They were doing quote-unquote legitimate movies. They were doing super low-budget genre fare. I don't know when Gore came out, but that's probably around this time. So they 80s, they were doing mid to late 80s. They were doing a lot of interesting things, and again, you couldn't pigeonhole in the same way there was a lot of studios, whether it was Wizard / Full Moon, or a lot of these places, film companies that were sort of finding a niche and really hammering it. Canon was doing all and working with big time actors, and obviously you said earlier some legendary directors, but it's hard because I give them a lot of credit for sort of putting their fingers in a lot of different pots and trying to do, not be pigeonholed as a studio that does one type of thing. But I do think they are far more well known for the Invasion USA type films than they are for the Runaway Trains, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. But, I give them credit for sort of branching out and making different kinds of films.
It's true. It's a perfect lead off because there's another film that I don't think that they put out to be one of their elites because there wasn't really anybody huge particularly associated with it, but has kind of grown to be one of the elites. And I think some people have even forgot that it was originally a canon film because I don't think the sequels were canon. And that's Highlander, the Highlander.
Yep.
With your old buddy Clancy Brown.
Which is still, I think, I love Clancy Brown even to this day. It's always great especially when he does stuff like, animation work and voiceover work and animation. When as soon as you hear his voice, you're like, oh, it's Clancy Brown. But Kurgan he'll always be Kurgan to me, no matter what else he does. I will say Highlander starts with it's one of my favorite movie openings ever, where it opens up on a Fabulous Freebirds wrestling match. Obviously the score and all the, we all know the Queen music and all the great rock and very driving score that they have in all of the soundtrack. That I just love the opening. It's as soon as I saw it for the first time, I was in. First off, I'm a big wrestling fan. I'm sure that will come up again. I think my high school friends had seen it before I'd seen it, or my junior high friends or whatever had seen it before I'd seen it, and they were big fans. And so, like, a lot of times when, like, you know, your friends like hype you up on something, sometimes things don't live up to the hype or whatever. But, you know, and I do think, you know, there's people are mixed on the sequels, especially the second one. I mean, the third one is not, people aren't really mixed on the third one, but the first one is just so goddamn good. And you know, I feel like Lambert was really good in it. And I do think, like, he did end up getting pigeonholed as a sort of genre actor, but he was legitimately a great actor. Clancy Brown was genius. Yeah, I mean, the first Highlander is great, and ended up being a big hit for it. They ended up doing a TV series as well, which I also was kind of a fan of at one point. But yeah, it's a great weird, like, sort of, you know, has its own mythology and its own sort of like sci-fi sort of fantasy kind of element. I just love all the design stuff. The whole mythology is great there. You know, the line, there can be only one, but it's definitely a film that, I'm sorry?
I was just going to say the visuals are fantastic too. It's
absolutely.
It's a music video director, which was kind of a new concept when this movie came out, was people were starting to graduate from doing music videos into making film. And this is one of them. And then the Queen soundtrack helps out a lot with that as well. But there are times where you're getting imagery that doesn't belong necessarily in that era on the big screen. You're getting MTV imagery. And there are some movies where I might be using that same comment to call out how shitty it is, but not in the case of Highlander. Highlander has all the good parts of music videos set to its sort of beat and style.
Yeah, and you know, it was definitely, it felt at the time especially very contemporary. And again, I think it was one of those rare cases where it was style and substance instead of style over substance. And again, I think, like, there's so many elements to it. And again, the time travel elements to it, and like, there's just, I mean, again, all the design stuff is great. Kurgan in his sort of more medieval outfit with that crazy sort of, I don't even know what it is, like a saber-toothed tiger skull. I don't even really know what it is. I actually had to draw Kurgan before, and in that outfit, and it was very difficult to get all of the detail. And then where he goes from that to his sort of 80s look, which is this weird sort of post-apocalyptic punk rock insanity. But man, he was so perfect in that role. But yeah, it's a great movie. I feel like at some point it became sort of like a joke, because it was just, people would be like, you know, oh, there can be only one. And obviously by the second one, which I was a fan of, but I know, like, a lot of it added a little bit more comedic elements. And, you know, we could talk about oh god, why am I blanking on one of the most famous actors ever? Sean Connery. Thank you. In fact, did I just forget Sean Connery's name on the last episode?
That's possible. Yeah,
I have something against Sean Connery, apparently.
Well, yeah, we were talking about Zardoz, but
oh, that's right, yeah.
Connery keeps coming up. I think it's cool that he took this, especially after Zardoz didn't scare him off of this type of work. But again, the accents, it's just like Runaway Trains. Connery has one accent. I'm not a Spaniard, I'm Egyptian. Except for, you know, in the next movie, I'm Russian, and that's the Chicago way. And it's the same voice and everything, no matter where he's from. But he's wonderful in this. You want him to stick around forever. I never saw the sequel. To me, Highlander had an ending. There can be only one, and that's kind of how I feel about it as a film series as well. I guess I could probably have my arm twisted into seeing the second one, but that's really only because Connery returned, and I would be curious on that level. Now, but I think as a standalone film, it's great.
Yeah. No, like I said, the first one's great. And in fact, like I said, it's one of those films that, like, should have been, you know, leave well enough alone.
It wraps up and it has a clear ending.
It's exactly. But I do feel like mentioning that, you know, I was very excited. I don't know why, for the third one. I can't remember the title, but it had Mario Van Peebles in it as the villain.
And just let me interject for just a moment. I noticed on the last episode, I referenced that Melvin Van Peebles was in the canon movie Rappin'. No, that was Mario Van Peebles.
Mario Van Peebles
was in Rappin'. So I just had to correct that wrong against Melvin Van Peebles, actually.
I'm sure Melvin appreciates that. I remember renting it with friends, being excited. For some reason, I thought it might be good, and I don't even think we made 20 minutes into it before we turned it off, and I don't think I ever finished the rest of it, but it was terrible. So, you know, there's a lot. We're not going to, as we discussed the last time, we're not going to go through every single film. Before I go into a movie that I'm very, very, very excited to talk about, I know you had mentioned that you had seen Murphy's Law when we were talking about canon's use of Charles Bronson. Do you want to discuss Murphy's Law?
Oh, I think I discussed it enough with that line.
Oh, that's right. Yes, that's right.
I am going to continue not fucking with Jack Murphy.
There you go. Yes, that's good. We'll leave it there.
I'll say this: it's I think the only one that I remember of the canon films that has a female villain, like an evil villain. So props to them having a female villain, I guess, versus Charles Bronson.
There you go. He doesn't punch her in it, does he?
I don't.
Let's not even.
So.
Let's leave that one alone.
No, I'm surveying in my head, but it's another one I watched with one eye. So he may have. I mean, he had to. He beats her. He wins.
There you go. Yeah, I mean, fair's fair, I guess. And we're bypassing some interesting films. So yeah. So the next, what I really want to talk about, what I'm most excited to talk about, is released in 1986. Is what I still consider to be the greatest achievement in film history, regardless of country, continent. It doesn't matter. Greatest film in film history is the 1906 classic by George Cosmatos. Cosmatos.
That's as good as I know.
Yeah, sure. And that is 1986 Cobra. Sylvester Stallone's, which is a very interesting, I'm sure you already know, it's got a very interesting backstory of like why it exists. And I still think it's as I sit next to basically a small shrine that you've helped contribute to, by the way, Devin, and I appreciate that.
Happy to.
For those that haven't seen it, it's based off of a book called Fair Game, which was also turned into a movie with Cindy Crawford and one of the Baldwins.
Some Baldwin or another that's not Alec.
One of the lesser Baldwins. It's
that's what Alec calls all of them, by the way. I'm Alec, and these are the lesser Baldwins.
But look, he's my favorite jerk. I mean, we could talk about jerks, but I mean, he's a jerk that I can live with because he's so goddamn talented. Anyways, we're not here to talk about Alec Baldwin. We're here to talk about the greatest movie ever made. Now, of course, I say that slightly sarcastically because I recognize that it's not necessarily the greatest movie ever made, but it is one of the most perfect films for what I enjoy in cinema. And like I said, I could make an entire series of podcasts about this just because I find I'm so fascinated by it. First, like I said, it's very loosely based off of this novel, but originally it was supposed to be, the original Beverly Hills Cop was supposed to be a Stallone movie, and the studio wanted to go in a comedic, way, and he wanted to do more an action film. So he left the project, and then Beverly Hills Cop became Beverly Hills Cop, and then he made this movie Cobra, which is, like I said, loosely based off of the novel Fair Game. Very quick, if you haven't seen it, I don't know what you're listening to this podcast for. So it's this weird fucking movie that makes very little sense in like when you really start to think about it. But he basically plays Marion Cobretti, who's an officer on the Zombie Squad, which is basically this sort of ambiguous division of the police department.
Which you never see, but they're consistently reminding you it exists. And that Cobretti is on it.
Only the most hard ass cops have to deal with the Zombie Squad, which basically deals with again, it's very ambiguous, but basically like serial killers it's not. Look, the movie opens up with people in the sewer clanging axes together. Like some of them are wearing suits, some of them are dressed like they're going on vacation, some of them are dressed like the homeless. It's this weird mishmash of people in the sewer rhythmically clanking axes together, and they never explain it, which is my favorite thing. Apparently in the script, it does kind of go more into who they are and kind of why they exist, but even that isn't from what I understand, it's not super detailed, but the movie doesn't explain it, which I think is the fucking greatest decision because it almost makes them more terrifying. But this whole basically this whole what it essentially is like a collective of people who believe that only the strong survive, and that there's going to be basically like an apocalypse, and that to survive the apocalypse, you have to basically be a ruthless killer, a hunter. They're trying to basically bring upon this survival of the fittest end of the world scenario kind of. They have there's corrupt cops involved in this, and so there's I'm explaining this way too much. The legendary Brian Thompson, who's a character actor that's been in a million things, usually because of his stature and his face, he's usually in makeup of some kind. He's been on all sorts of sci-fi and action TV series and stuff. but he plays one of my favorite, maybe my favorite ever movie villain, the Night Slasher. But basically, it's you have Stallone. There's this basically like there's all these murders going on, and nobody can find it out. Like because it's like this group of people, they can't really find out who's doing it. Like the cops don't know what's happening. They don't know who is committing these vicious murders. And one night, Brigitte Nielsen, who plays this supermodel kind of chick.
In a Stallone movie? No.
In fact, there's an interesting story about that. I will get to that in a second. She basically sees them. She can ID them. She drives upon one of they're out to kill her, and Stallone basically is, as a cop, him and his partner have to basically protect her and stuff, and also try to solve this mystery of who's committing these vicious, heinous murders. The movie's bananas in all of the best ways. Every 5 minutes there's something that happens where you're like, what the fuck? What? One of my favorite things, which I was obsessed with as a kid, but as an adult I've come to realize that I'm not the only one, which is the way that Marin Cobretti eats pizza, which is he eats it cold with a pair of scissors, and he keeps his gun cleaning tools in the refrigerator as well, with like in a egg carton. He's got all of his gun cleaning tools there. I've noticed all these other people who are fans of the film or who have at least seen it, who are also fascinated the way that Cobra eats pizza, which is cold with a pair of scissors. And he only takes he cuts off a little slice of pizza and eats it. That's his nourishment. And of course you have Stallone, who's like this jacked, oiled specimen of a man, and his whole nourishment is 1/4 of a slice of cold pizza that he cuts with a pair of scissors. And there's a lot of other fascinating things that I won't go into it. But at one point, the movie actually held, I don't know if it still holds the record for the most on-screen people shot by one character. I don't know this statistic because I don't do my homework, but I think it was something like 65. He shoots basically and kills like 65 people during this movie.
I believe it.
I think the record's been broken since. The movie's one of the greatest endings of all time. All of the dialogue in this movie I want chiseled on my tombstone. But it's one of the most memorable, quotable, stupid movies ever made. It's just pure. When somebody says the word macho or machismo, I immediately think of this movie. It's like, It's insane. Interesting fact, though, Sylvester Stallone was married. He was married and he was filming on location somewhere and staying in his hotel room. And Brigitte Nielsen found out where he was staying and sent up an envelope full of nudes to his hotel room.
How classic.
And he was impressed, and you can take the rest from there. He did call her up to his room, and then he started putting in her movies. So, and dating her. So, is this movie the greatest movie ever made? It is to me, but I think it's definitely. And it's funny. I could have sworn it carried the Canon logo. It was Golan Globus. They produced it, but apparently it was Warner's that released it. But
they had a side deal. Canon at various times, some of these were released by MGM for the distributor. Warner Brothers was around for a tiny bit, but they bounced around to different distributors, but they were always Canon films. But I do think that affected whether they were going to give the classic Canon logo.
Because again, I mean, that's the thing is I could have. So I literally, ironically, Devin, today, literally, I just got home before we started recording this podcast. I was in Austin all day, and my Scream Factory Blu-ray arrived today.
Of Cobra?
Yeah, of Cobra. I didn't
Sweet.
own the Scream Factory release.
Well, now I know what to not get you for Christmas.
Because I owned it on Blu-ray. There you go. But anyways, yeah, I'll say that's enough from me for Cobra. But obviously, I could talk about it more. But it's definitely, I think, one of the most seminal pictures that they made, as far as I'm concerned, because I feel like, especially by 1986, it sort of summed up what they did. There's some other films on this list that I'm almost as passionate about, almost right there, but it's hard to anything. Not as many films hit me on the same level, but there's a few on this list that are pretty goddamn close. But yeah, what about you? What film do you want to talk about next, Devin?
Outside of agreeing with you on Cobra is every kind of machismo trope rolled into one. And I wanted to see it so bad as a kid, and for whatever reason, I wasn't allowed to see it. I think around the same age I had seen The Terminator and things like that. That you know how it is when you're a kid. Somehow certain movies just become the ones you're not allowed to see, even though you've seen much worse. For whatever reason, I wasn't allowed to see Cobra until I was a little older, and then I saw it as a teenager. I think I probably saw it with my best friend Greg, but yeah, just every line is some sort of a pithy classic, and I would. Kill to see the uncut version. Apparently there's a print of this that's got like 45 minutes additional that some fans have, but it's never been made available. I'm assuming you haven't seen it, or else you would have said something. Have you seen the uncut Cobra?
So I think around 2010, there was a copy. There was a torrent copy that you could watch, but people kept saying it was. I think it ended up being, if I'm not mistaken, it was only it really only had 15 minutes of unused footage. There was longer cuts. I know the opening was longer and a little bit different, but there is a legendary quote unquote director's cut. But I mean, I've heard rumors that it existed, but I don't know anybody who's actually seen it myself. Like I said, the one thing I'd seen, like I said, God, maybe it was even earlier than 2010, might have been 2008, 2007. Like I said, it only had an extra 15 minutes, and it was kind of a work cut looking thing, if I'm not mistaken, if I remember correctly. Yeah, I think like I said, a lot of them were either longer cuts, like where it was an extra 30 seconds to a minute to a scene. Nothing outrageous. Like I said, they do kind of. I do remember, if I'm not mistaken, one of the scenes midway point where there's a sequence where there's actually, I think, another corrupt cop, if I'm not mistaken. There's a female cop in the movie who is she's a cop, and she's also a member of she's basically undercover. She's a member of this cult or whatever, the crime cult. And I do feel like there was an exposition there where she does sort of explain. I would need to rewatch it to be certain, but like I said, if I remember correctly, it was maybe an extra 15 minutes of actual new footage or different footage. And again, like I said, it was a work cut or something. It was pretty poor quality, but I know it's existed, but I've never been able to find it. And obviously I've looked for it, but viewers, if you're out there and you've seen it, or where I can get a copy, for God's sakes, let us know, because I want to see it. But I know it's never going to get released. So
there was a similar situation with the Apple. They found about 10 years or so ago, there was a fire in the backlot of Universal Studios, including in their archives, and they discovered a new print of the Apple. And I believe it was actually sent to the Silent Movie Theater in LA, which is now shut down, bordered, and gone off to Me Too land, unfortunately. But at the time, they ran this print of the Apple that had an opening with Mr. Top explaining who Alfie and BB were. And from all accounts, it makes the movie no more or less confusing, but it does have some extra songs and some extra verses and stuff. I would love to see that. And that has been, and it started to make the rounds as on the midnight movie circuit, just as the original print of the Apple did. And it sounds like someone stole it. So,
oh, really?
Yeah. When Kino Lorber, I think it's Kino Lorber, who put the Apple out on Blu-ray finally, I think they were trying to find both cuts, and they could only find the original cut to remaster. So maybe that's still forthcoming. But I think somebody jacked the extended version of the Apple for their own personal collection, which is pretty shitty.
That sucks, yeah.
Yeah. But springboarding off of Cobra, I think the natural spot is Over the Top, which I would really just kind of want to put out there just so that I can say that I side with Robert Loggia on this one.
Please explain.
Well, for those who haven't seen Over the Top, it's another mid-'80s classic with Sylvester Stallone. It was, unlike Cobra, this was not a passion project of Stallone's. Menachem Golan directed this himself again and convinced Stallone to do the film by fattening his wallet. And Stallone basically figured, well, who's ever going to watch it? And I think it was a hit. I don't think, we're still talking about Over the Top. In my school, the best summation I can give of Over the Top is actually from a friend of mine in high school. This guy that I went through drama class with named Matt. When he went off to college and he wrote for his college paper, he did a list for the paper of the top 5 greatest arm wrestling movies ever made. And the list was completely blank, except for Over the Top was number 4.
Disrespect. Now, Devin, I'm going to go on record as saying I am a giant fan of this movie.
Oh, and me too. I don't think that
there's something about, I wouldn't want to even have dinner with Sylvester Stallone. Like, I have there's nothing inside me for even the smallest part that would want to have a personal interaction with Stallone. But goddamn, for some reason, as a child, he made movies I really enjoyed. And for some reason, Stallone had a huge impact on me as a kid. Like, he made movies I loved. I mean, say what you want about Stallone, especially by the mid-'80s, but, he was obviously a talented writer and director. I mean, he made amazing films. The first Rocky is a legitimately great film. The First Blood, he was fantastic in it. He was a very capable actor. But, he became an icon. He became a superstar. So, but yeah, as a kid, he was making movies I wanted to see. I wanted to see movies about arm wrestling. I wanted to see movies about arm wrestling absentee fathers who pushed Terry Funk through plate glass windows and argued with Robert Loggia. Now, real quick, though, you have to explain the Robert Loggia thing, because I've never heard Robert Loggia's opinions on this movie, but I'm very curious to hear what they are.
Oh, I would be too. I unfortunately, I have no Robert Loggia news to deliver. I'm speaking purely on a plot level. That kid belongs in Robert Loggia's house because Lincoln Hawk is going to make the worst father for that poor kid, Michael.
How dare you, sir? How dare you?
Hey, I'm not denying that Robert Loggia is a dick in this movie. He's the grandfather. I don't know exactly what's going on with the family situation. Stallone is playing another great name because amongst Rocky Balboa, John Rambo, and Marion Cobretti, now he's Lincoln Hawk, which is the toughest name ever. It's awesome. I love it. And I love this movie. But we get very vague ideas that he ran out on his family at some point. And every time his son Michael tries to get him to open up, like, why did you go? Why did you never come back? All we really get in form of an answer is, it's complicated. And it's, he never really says what. There's allusions at certain points to drugs. We don't know if that's because he's dealing them or taking them at the time that he ran away from his family, but he can't give a direct answer to his son. And his ex-wife, the kid's mother, is dying of what I can only assume is heart cancer, because they never tell you what her diagnosis is, and she's waiting for a heart transplant. What's wrong with mom? She's waiting for a heart transplant, whatever the hell that means. And on top of Lincoln Hawk being late to his son's graduation and then being late to the hospital so that the kid never gets to see his mother again, and then he's late to the funeral. He's late to everything. He completely screws this kid over. Can't give him any reasons why he ran away. And when it comes down to, well, what are you going to do if you get the kid? And the kid can either stay with his wealthy grandfather, who's a douchebag played by Robert Loggia, although if Lincoln had a bad drug habit, then maybe Loggia is warranted in being a dick to him. And certainly Loggia can give him the kid money and protection. Stallone, he just says, the only important thing is that we're together, and it's so you're going to take custody of your son. And you're what, just going to ride around in a truck from arm wrestling tournament to arm wrestling tournament? Like, the kid's got to go to school. The kid's got to have a roof. There's no plan. There's no history. It's just he should be with Stallone because it's Stallone. I side with Robert Loggia. I think that kid belongs with Robert Loggia. Just being fair.
I don't know if we can be friends. I don't know if we can film this podcast anymore with your terrible disparaging of Lincoln Hawks and he's the boy's day. He just wants to be with his son. And look, dude,
being together is enough, Mike.
I didn't realize you were such a pessimist. I thought you were a romantic, Devin. He's going to teach his son how to arm wrestle strangers in diners and
you're right. You're right. I take it back.
Come on, man. He beat Bill Hurley to win. That's the motivation through the whole movie is that, all he cares about is getting a new truck. He has a truck. They don't show it breaking down. Yes, it's an older truck, but they don't explain how it's going to improve his life. Like, why is that going to take him to the next level? Like, is there any trucking company out there that gives a shit about, unless your truck cab is breaking down consistently, which they never show it do. I was like, what is this motivation? I mean, I would think money would be a motivation. They're going to call it Hawk and Sons. So.
Son and Hawk.
Son and Hawk, that's right.
He does bet money on himself, though. He bets $7,000 on himself in the contest, and he's 20-1. So he made a good chunk there. They do mention $100,000 being the prize at the over-the-top arm wrestling tournament, but it's unclear in my mind whether that $100,000 is the value of the truck or if there's a cash prize on top of the truck. I also was a little bit
I think
confused.
it was the value of the truck, if I'm not mistaken.
I'm also a little confused. I didn't know that all professional arm wrestlers were truckers, but that's cool.
That's a goddamn good point, Devin. I never even thought about that before.
Because the grand prize is a new truck for all these truckers that like to arm wrestle. You know, again, I don't mean to shit on it. There are other movies I love Hercules, the canon version of Hercules with Lou Ferrigno, which is one of the worst things ever put on celluloid. It's him fighting a guy in a bear costume, and when they needed a real bear for cutaway shots, they just cut them out of the movie Grizzly. Some of the worst special effects you've ever seen in your life, including Lou Ferrigno as a special effect. Whoever they got to dub Lou Ferrigno sounds nothing like what you would expect Lou Ferrigno would sound like from his look. Now, of course, the real Lou Ferrigno has some hearing issues that made it necessary for them to dub him. So I'm not dogging on Ferrigno.
Just making fun of the disabled, Devin. New low.
But on this long list of movies that are, you know, tongue-in-cheek or so bad they're good at best in some of these cases, there were several parts in Over the Top and rewatching it where I was just like, that's at least got to be called out or mentioned. And one of them is that the prize for this big tournament is exactly what Lincoln Hawk wants.
Yes,
a new truck.
That's a good point. I'm sure. I mean, that's the thing is like how the convenience of that, but the fact that like everybody else is like these professional arm wrestlers are all fighting for a truck. I mean, I don't know. Maybe in the 80s that was legitimate. Maybe that was a thing, but it's a good call out because
could be.
I never considered that before.
And then he also he loses an argument to his son and makes it seem like it was never an argument. His son is an elitist because he's rich and he's giving him all that shit, intellectual shit about how he's higher class and hangs out with a higher group of people than his lowly truck driver father. In which case Stallone is getting appropriately frustrated with that attitude.
Yeah.
And finally he's like, "Yeah, you think you're so smart? Why don't you drive the rig?" And first off, bad father lets his 12-year-old kid drive the Mack truck down an actual street. So again, point Robert Loggia. But the kid can actually drive the rig, like very quickly figures out how to drive the rig, which A, proves that it does not take intelligence to drive Lincoln Hawk's rig and blows his point out of the water, or the kid just is a natural at it. I guess we can go that route. But Stallone, seeing his kid drive the rig, goes, "I knew you had it in you." And it's like, no, you didn't. That's why you challenged him to drive it, because he wanted to make him look stupid.
I do not appreciate your lambasting of Lincoln Hawks, and I'll forgive you. But
I love that movie. I will rewatch that movie because it just brings up so many memories of childhood, and it's fun. And it's not made for me. It's made for 10-year-olds. It's made for kids like the kid in this movie. I'm not the target audience.
Yeah, and like I said, it's a great. I enjoy it. You know, they had real life arm wrestlers in it, and like I said, I thought the villain Bull Hurley was very. Like I said, I thought he was and he had done a few movies outside of that. He did try to become an actor, and in fact, he lost a lot of weight at one point. But I always thought Bull Hurley was a cool character. I still want his Master Blaster T-shirts. But yeah, it's a movie. I will have you know, Devin, it was popular enough that it did actually get a toy line. That toy line didn't exist for very long, and now those figures go for a lot of money. They're very sought after because they were so limited release. So it was popular enough to get a toy line, but not popular enough that the toys were very successful.
I think I remember that. Did they come with like an arm wrestling table?
They did. Yes, they did.
Okay, I remember that toy line. Oh my God, I'm flashing back. See, but there again, proof positive this film was not made for me. This was to a 10, 11, 12-year-old kid. Truck driving Stallone is the perfect dad, and he definitely did.
That's right. How dare you question Lincoln Hawks? All right, let's get through this. They did a couple things that were important at the time. The Robotech, the movie, which is
people forget that was a canon.
Yep. Which is a very the history of Robotech is so fucking confusing and convoluted because it was 3 different properties that Harmony Gold bought to make into an American series, and there was Macro. There's it's too confusing. By the time that movie meant a lot to me. There's a movie that's very interesting is Avenging Force, which was basically Canon was really trying to make Michael Dudikoff like another big character or another big action star. Another
Norris. I think he probably had more talent than Norris too. I think if they had tried to teach Dudikoff, if they had given him acting lessons instead of martial arts lessons, they might have had something on their hands because Dudikoff has a raw talent and he definitely has a look.
Yeah, exactly.
And doesn't get
He's
enough
like
credit.
the opposite of, like, he wasn't the greatest martial artist, but he was a competent actor, where, Chuck Norris was a martial artist who turned into an actor. So sort of weird, like mirror
Reverse
opposites
thing,
of each
yeah.
other a little bit. Yeah. Let's do this. Let's get into what I really do think of anything to associate with Canon as a film company. To me, it's what they did with Jean-Claude. Like, they really made Jean-Claude a star. They gave him 2 of his most well-known, beloved films.
I would say 3.
And then they also did, so they did Cyborg, which is an interesting movie, which let's touch about Cyborg after we talk about some other movies on this list.
Okay, I get you.
Because it has weird history.
I know exactly where you're going.
But so when I said there was a film on this list that almost rivaled its importance to me, rivaled Cobra as far as a movie that meant a lot to me, we need to talk about Bloodsport, which I actually will say, and I say this with not even a hint of irony or hyperbole. I think Bloodsport is the greatest American martial arts movie, for a multitude of reasons I could get into. Again, a lot of these movies I could talk about forever. Bloodsport has a very interesting, the history of Bloodsport as a movie is interesting on its own. The fact that it was, quote unquote, based off of a real person. It was based off of a real person, but the real person himself was a giant liar.
Yeah.
The real Frank Dukes. But the movie is weirdly one of the most rewatchable movies.
It has a lot of heart.
It does. And Jean-Claude, yes, 100%. And Jean-Claude, he sort of repeated things he would do later on in this movie, as far as, like, you have his training sequences. In fact, we'll get onto that in another Canon film. But it just, everything works. All of the fight themselves are great. And having Bolo Young, who already was a international well-known actor in the Orient, having been Chinese Hercules, and he fought Bruce Lee. Bolo Young had a name in Asia to begin with, but he brings this gravitas to this film. As Chung Li, the villain in this movie, as a kid, I used to refer to him as buff Chinese Gary Shandling, because that's what he looks like to me. As a kid, it was this weird thing I couldn't get out of my head. But goddamn, this movie features Donald Gibb as my favorite film character ever. Jackson. I was actually just having I'm on a different podcast for our listeners. I'm actually on several podcasts. I don't know why anybody would. Anyways, let's not go there. But
all of which I enjoy.
Are we talking about,
by the way, James? I'm on none of them, and I can objectively say I enjoy all of the podcasts I've listened to.
I appreciate that. I appreciate your support, Devin. We recently talked about the greatest duos in action film history, and I had to bring up Frank Dukes and Jackson, because I think Donald Gibb and Jean-Claude weirdly have this really great chemistry on screen together. And at first, the way they introduce him, you don't think you're going to like Donald Gibb's character. You think he's going to be another meathead a la Ogre in Revenge of the Nerds, but he turns out to be like this very lovable biker guy. The movie's great, and one of the reasons I say it's one of the best, if not the best, American-produced martial arts film is, first off, the movie is literally only about martial arts. There's no terrorist plot. There's nothing.
That guy is the opponent in the ring.
It's all about the actual fighting and what happens in the ring. The Kumite is a real thing, or at least it's believed to be really true. The way that's portrayed in this movie is far more fantastical and a little eye-rolly, and this this sort of there really is people believe there really was a Kumites, where basically really great martial artists were invited from all over the world and to compete, and it was like a no holds barred, that wasn't for a belt or anything. It was literally just for saying who's the greatest martial artist and stuff. And there are people who believe that those things really did exist. But anyways, this movie's over the top. It's great. Every single fight sequence in it is really memorable. I think it's Jean-Claude Van Damme's best movie. He would go on to have more nuanced roles, especially late career Jean-Claude Van Damme, who had sort of renaissance a few years ago. But at this point, it was pre all of the outrageous drug abuse, and his ego hadn't really gone super off the rails yet, as it would for say Street Fighter. But he's even though he wasn't the most competent actor, he has a likability and a real believability in this role, and it really made him a star. I remember being in school, and there wasn't one male boy who wasn't obsessed with this movie. And then obviously there has been a lot of obviously the Street Fighter video games, the Mortal Kombat, all these fighting games, and a lot of them they attempts to make these sort of video game adaptations of these fighting video games. At the end, that's what this was before all of those games, or at least the majority of the well-known ones. It's basically the plot of one of those games, and it's done really well, and it's really great dialogue, some really goofy, fun characters and stuff. So it's
his mentor at the start of the movie is his best friend's dad, who ends up teaching him. That's the dynamic I remember, anyways. Played by the guy from the beginning of Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom that poisons Dr. Jones. It took me a minute to recognize him.
Huh? I don't remember that. The Japanese guy?
Yeah, he was the guy at the beginning of Temple of Doom at the Club Obi-Wan, who, he holds up the antidote. Indy says, "What's that?" And it's the antidote to the poison you just drank, Dr. Jones.
Okay, I'm gonna admit something on this podcast that if you're friends with me in real life, you probably already know. Not a big fan of the Indiana Jones films.
Yes.
At least, not that I think they're bad movies.
That.
Yeah, but I do think Temple of Doom is my favorite one, which is always to much people's chagrin. Oh, it's funny. I'll have to rewatch it to remember that. But even though, like I said, the real Frank Dukes claimed that he was taught. He basically, as a young kid, studying in Asia, in East Asia, I don't know where exactly, but he was American in the movie because Jean-Claude Van Damme obviously wasn't going to play an American, but he basically tried to steal this very expensive katana sword, and he was caught by the guy whose house he was breaking into, and basically beat him, like made him become like a punching bag for his son to learn martial arts, and then ended up really thinking like, hey, this young Frank Dukes kid has a lot of gumption, and he's got a natural aptitude. And yeah, it's goofy shit, but it works in the movie, especially in 1988 or whatever the movie came out. But yeah, it's great. I'd say the second one, which was I think maybe a year later, was Kickboxer, which is they have a lot of similar plot points. And this one
more of the same. I think Bloodsport's the winner in that of those two.
No, yeah, absolutely. Even though I have a giant soft spot for Kickboxer as well, I think the ending's super tough. Basically in that it's his brother is the American kickboxing star, and Jean-Claude Van Damme's just like his brother, who like they're brothers who were raised separately. Their parents divorced and they were raised separately. And Van Damme's mother took him over to France. I don't remember where, but that's why he has an accent and his brother doesn't. But anyways, his brother's this cocky American fighter who goes to Thailand because that's where real kickboxing is, and he thinks he's going to just go over there and just roll over those dudes. And then he meets Tung Po, who paralyzes him, and then Jean-Claude Van Damme wants to learn martial art, learn true Thai kickboxing to get revenge for his brother. And that's the movie. There's some weird
some dancing.
There's an American, which is my favorite sequence in film history. My mother loved Jean-Claude, loved his butt, and loved that sequence. My mom actually thought he was a good dancer, which I find very bizarre. But to this day, I can do that dance perfectly.
I've seen it.
Beat.
I've asked you to do it before. It used to be a thing at the parties, Hey, James.
That's right.
Can you give us some Van Damme?
Anybody said like do the Van Damme, and I'd have to do it. Yeah, like the truffle shuffle. But yeah, I love the movie, but it's basically just one of those very formulaic white guy gets taught by his Asian mentor, his Asian sensei, whether it's Thailand or Okinawa or Hong Kong. Just put white guy learns martial art from Asian guy, which is basically every 80s martial art movie. But it's fun. It's really great. The action's really good, which I feel like still though those are two probably, well, not necessarily my favorites. I love both of them, and Bloodsport's my favorite, but I think there's other works of his that still hold up for me. But like there is a movie Cyborg, but we'll talk about that later. Did you want to say anything else about Jean-Claude or any of his other movies?
My experience with Jean-Claude Van Damme is a little different than yours. I was aware of him and I'd seen the movies growing up. I wasn't the fan that you were, though. In fact, my favorite part was the dancing. And I always knew you were a huge fan, and so I never really told you I was not a huge fan.
I don't blame you, but...
but no, then I saw JCVD, which was Jean-Claude Van Damme's initials, and also a movie he made around 2008 in which he plays himself, and it begs a re-examination of his earlier work. So I love the movie so much. Him playing himself and how honest he was, and how like he's in this really hard custody battle trying to get custody of his daughter. And when his daughter is asked if she would want to go with her father, she point blank says no. And the reason is because she's embarrassed of the movies he makes and the kids at school make fun of her. And I thought that was so raw for Jean-Claude to lay his own ego on the line. And he fully acknowledges the drug use, the obscene spending, the ego. He really lays himself bare and makes himself extremely likable. And suddenly I went back and rewatched. I started with the canon movies. I still haven't gotten through the entire filmography because it's going to take some time. But I did go over the canon movies again, and I like them so much more now just by having a better understanding of who Jean-Claude was himself or is himself. And I know that he's playing himself in a movie, but it's still a movie. It's not as if he's actually playing in a documentary.
No.
So I know that I'm still following a fabrication of Jean-Claude Van Damme, but I am infinitely more interested in him since seeing that movie. And I appreciate Kickboxer and Bloodsport on a much higher level than I ever did when I was young.
Devin, did you see his Amazon series, Jean-Claude Van Johnson?
I saw like the first half of the first episode, but we're literally talking 2 days ago. Because of this podcast, I wanted to catch some of it. I do intend to go back and watch the rest.
It's definitely in the same vein of JCVD, where it's like, it's more of a comedy, even though there's definitely comedic elements in JCVD. It's more of a comedy, but again, it's him playing with his public persona and portraying him as far less cool and far less capable. Two real quick things about Jean-Claude before we move on. One is my favorite story about Jean-Claude Van Damme is he got into a bar fight. I think it was at Scores Strip Club in New York. It was him, Chuck Zito. Chuck Zito was basically murdering him. Chuck Zito, who was a former Hell's Angel, who my father knew. Actually, my father knew him from Lowell, Massachusetts from childhood. But he was an actor. He's been in a lot of things. He was a real life tough guy, but he was at Scores and he was beating up Jean Van Damme. And there was I forget who else was in the melee, but Mickey Rourke was the one that broke the fight up. And I always thought that it's funny that Mickey Rourke, if you know Mickey Rourke is the voice of reason in your squabble, there's a problem. And then my other favorite thing is you sort of midway through his career, Jean-Claude Van Damme developed this giant knot on his head. I don't know if you've ever noticed that, Devin. Do you know how he got that knot on his head?
No, I don't.
Dolph Lundgren almost killed him. Dolph Lundgren, besides being a fascinating human being, what maybe people don't understand is, like, even though Jean-Claude Van Damme is known for to be in martial arts, and he did Shotokan Karate, which is more of a show. Dolph Lundgren was legitimately a real martial artist and a bad motherfucker, besides being 6'5" and in unbelievable shape. And they got into a little bit of an argument on the set of Universal Soldiers, sort of alpha mailing each other. And Dolph Lundgren knocked him out and gave him that giant knot on his head that he still has to this day, which I always loved. But real quick, before we move on, this is a very long podcast, but I have to say, my favorite Jean-Claude Van Damme movie that's not Bloodsport, and I feel like someday we need to talk about this movie, is the movie, and it's his first speaking role, not as we mentioned, he was in the movie Breakin', is No Retreat, No Surrender, which I can't say enough about. It's one of the most ludicrous movies I've ever seen. It's a childhood favorite. But he plays a villain. He plays the heavy. And I think that's why I was a Jean-Claude Van Damme fan from the second I saw him on. And I was fascinated by the guy, but he plays this like Russian villain, which is, he never, after that he played, always was he's a good looking guy, fantastic shape and very athletic, obviously known for doing the splits, but he started off his cinematic as a villain, which I was fun. And it was definitely a movie I'd love to talk about, but let's try to wrap this up. We don't want to go too long on our audience. I'll let you kind of go to the next segment.
Well, speaking of supervillains, what are your thoughts on Lex Luthor, James?
I feel like he is the quintessential supervillain in the traditional sense. I mean, technically speaking, he was the first, Superman being the first actual costumed superpowered supervillain. There was the Crimson Avenger before him and some other literary characters who did have an influence on Superman, but Superman was the first of his kind through that, even though Lex Luthor wasn't in the original comic, it took a while for him to appear. He still sort of holds that place as a sort of mad genius, ruthless supervillain. Even though he doesn't have any powers, he uses his mind for his evil machinations and eventually his great wealth and power as he's become more of a postmodern character. But I've always loved him, whether he's the evil mayor of Metropolis or he's the evil mad scientist sort of Lex Luthor. But he had a very interesting path on the big and small screen, portrayed in varying degrees of success. But I've always been a fan, Devin. Why? I mean, I know why you ask, but why do you ask?
Well, canon was really coming into its own by the mid-'80s. And, of course, Menachem and Yoram are both feeling like they can make it big time now. They've worked with Stallone. They've created their own franchises. They've purchased other franchises, such as Death Wish and The Exterminator. And so when Superman 3 turned out to be well, I guess back then they were calling it a cinematic turd. I actually think there's some endearing parts to part 3, but I think everyone's more or less willing to call it a mistake. But but Warner Brothers was not interested in making another Superman after Superman 3. And Cannon said, well, what if we do it? So then we ended up with Superman 4, The Quest for Peace. I really don't think there are any other sequels in which the hardcore fans are more in agreement as being the worst of a franchise. It's actually hard to find very much at all that's endearing within Superman 4. Part of the problem was, as I mentioned before, Cannon was releasing almost a movie a week. And as these movies would either become successes or failures from week to week, keeping in mind that they're all very much competing with one another at that kind of level, the budget for Superman 4 kept on getting slashed and slashed. It went from being like almost a $40 million budget to being something like $17 million after they had already secured Christopher Reeve and Gene Hackman. And to secure Christopher Reeve, they had to offer him a writing credit, and they had to agree to produce his pet project, Street Smart. But and they also allowed Christopher Reeve to kind of put whatever kind of messaging he wanted into it, and he chose nuclear warfare for Superman to go after in this one. And I don't know how they got Gene Hackman back at that kind of a budget. I would have thought that Gene Hackman would have asked for that full amount, $17 million just for him alone. But I'll tell you what does work about it. No matter how bad the movie gets, Christopher Reeve never once phoned in a performance as Superman, and he plays the role. Even if the special effects are just disgusting in this movie compared to the other films especially, he plays it so straightforward and gives it everything he has. A sequence where he's on a double date with Lois Lane as both Clark Kent and Superman, and with Mariel Hemingway's characters, the fourth one in that double date. It's such a sitcom trope, the one person trying to be two people on a double date. But Christopher Reeve trying to pull that dumbass plot device off as Superman and Clark was actually really endearing. He actually plays it as straight as he can. And Gene Hackman is amazing even when he is phony. So between those two performers, no matter how bad the script is, I do think that Superman 4 does have some redeeming value, but it's very slim. And it did bring down Cannon more than a few pegs in the film industry. What are your thoughts on Superman 4, James?
It's a fucking piece of it's a rotting turd. As a kid, I will say this. As a kid, I was excited because even though Solar Man, who I making
Nuclear Man
comparisons, but Nuclear Man, excuse me, which I, as a kid, referred to as Shadow Stevens with Lee Presley nails. I don't know if you get that reference. But he was a supervillain, and even though he wasn't forgive the play on the word, but he wasn't a canon superhero from the Superman mythology. He was the original creation for the film. I was like, oh, that's cool. Superman actually gets to fight an actual supervillain for once. But then, of course, I saw the movie and was really depressed. Even as a kid, I loved the third one. In fact, Superman 3 still features one of the most disturbing film sequences to me. It traumatized me as a kid. The robot, yes, when she gets put into the wires.
Oh, that's still freaky.
It still freaks me out. But
I still have the soundtrack to Superman 3, so I acknowledge it's a bad movie. But seeing Superman drunk, all that growing up, I thought it was great. And
that sequence is still great. So people who don't like it can kiss my. But what I will say is that it was definitely a scenario where even as a kid, I wasn't. You don't think critically as a kid. As a kid who loved Superman and loved all the movies and was excited to see new Superman, I remember being like pretty bummed out, pretty disappointed. And again, as a kid, I didn't really notice the giant deficit in the budget and the really shitty special effects. I mean, there was some cool, as a kid, the sequence when he puts him in the elevator and swings him around and shoots him to the moon. Like, there were some cool things, I guess, in it, even as a kid, before I became very, you start thinking things more critically and, from that mindset. I was pretty disappointed and pretty bummed out. And when they, afterwards, when you find out they're not going to make any new Superman movies, you're like, yeah, that's probably for the best. That makes sense.
Yeah, that's tight.
But, but I loved, Christopher Reeves. But yeah, it's a smoking turd. They should never have been made. It goes out on a sour note, which was a thing for superhero movies of that era. So, but yeah. it's a bummer, but it exists. So.
And you can see little glimmers of kind of what it might have almost been. Apparently, there, much like the other canon films, there's a longer cut of this, and a lot of the deleted scenes ended up on the DVD, and none of them make it really any much more coherent, particularly. I have not confirmed this, But I did hear a rumor that they were kicking around the idea at one point that this whole nuclear man experiment that Lex Luthor is going through with was going to end up developing a Bizarro Superman, which would have been the first and only Bizarro Superman on screen. And that could have been interesting. If this had
that would have been cool, actually.
Even as dumb as this movie was, if it was Bizarro Superman, it probably would have had something worth speaking of this long after. But instead, they gave us, as you said, Shadow Steeds with Lee press-on nails. And Lex Luthor, the greatest criminal mind of our time, creates an indestructible creature whose only weakness is nighttime. I don't know how
what
that
more
works.
Can you say?
Right? So, at this point, after this movie failed, Canon was really in hot water. They had spent more than they should have, and it was still less than they planned to. And they really needed something to save their asses. And I'm willing to bet that you can guess what they tried to save their asses with.
Yeah. Look, as a kid from the 80s, it was probably the most hyped I'd ever been for a movie at that point. Had a lot of excitement going into it. And I will say it holds up better now than my original impression of it. To the fact that, I'm a fan of the movie. I own the movie. I own a
Nostalgia has been
fan.
more kind to this one than it has been to Superman 4. I'll give it that.
Yes, but I'm assuming you're talking about Masters of the Universe.
I am talking about... I'm definitely not talking about the Andrew McCarthy classic Mannequin, which Canon also produced.
Which is a great movie. And
much better than He-Man and the Masters of the Universe.
Yes. So here's the thing. As a kid, you wanted to see the He-Man that you saw from the toy in his universe and from the cartoon on screen. In that realm, they failed epically, but as an adult, I appreciate for what it is. First off, they had some legendary illustrators, and they had the greatest French cartoonist of all time, Jean Giraud, aka Mobius, was working on it. William Stout, who was an amazing illustrator and cartoons, done all these amazing, production design work on all sorts of incredible films. There's so much about it I actually am a fan of, but it didn't do well at the time. So one of my favorite things about the Masters of the Universe movie is Skeletor. I was a fan of the character from the cartoon. I was happy to see him on screen. What is very surprising is that, if you were to not know about this movie and be like, okay, this is the 80s, who's going to play Skeletor opposite Dolph Lundgren? And it's Frank Langella, the amazing actor Frank Langella, who's had a very impressive career. And one of my favorite things about this movie is that Frank Langella still says it's one of his favorite performances he's ever done.
Yep.
That he really enjoyed the character once he learned to sort of realize how to portray the character in this sort of over-the-top thespian, almost Shakespearean kind of way. And he's great in it. He's the best thing about the movie.
He's the only one that looks like he's having fun. Him and Strickland are the only ones that look like they're having fun making this movie.
I will say the greatest casting is Meg Foster as Eva Lynn, because Jesus Christ, perfect casting. Like Meg Foster's those pale blue eyes.
People back then thought she was wearing contacts.
She was wearing contacts. Nope. No. That was Meg Foster's brilliant blue eyes, ghostly pale blue eyes. But yeah, she was great in it. It's known for being, having a young Courtney Cox in it. It had a bunch of characters that weren't in the cartoon because smartly at the time, if you're in Mattel's shoes, you're having this big movie come out, you don't want to just put in characters that already exist. You want to sell new toys. So instead of having Orko, you had Gwildor. Instead of having Triclops or Trapjaw, you had Sauron and Blade and all these different characters. So they made new action figures. But as a kid, you're like, where the shit is Trapjaw? Where is Merman? Where's Triclops?
That's exactly the problem. It was the focus group on this had to have been cracked, because to me, it feels like if they had done a focus group on children, the market for this movie in 1987, and got a list of every single thing that they would want out of a He-Man movie, it seems to me like they had done that for this and then just said, okay, now we're going to do the opposite. They worked against every single thing that people would have wanted in that movie. There's no cringer. Most of the movie takes place on Earth instead of Endor. You never see Hiss Mountain. Eternia, sorry. Endor is Ewok, sorry.
No worries.
I'm mixing my mythologies there. But yeah, there's no Prince Adam, so there's no purpose for the power of Grayskull and the big transition. Everything that kids loved about that cartoon and about that toy series just yanked out of it for the sake of they like Orko, but we want to give them a new Billy Barty character. No, we didn't want a new Billy Barty character.
Nobody wants Billy Barty characters.
I do now, but
Yeah.
Billy Barty, by the way, was one of the original members of Spike Jones and his City Slickers. If you listen to Novelty Music, so he's
was he really?
Yeah, he was in show business for decades prior to doing this or Foul Play or UHF or any of the things we really know Billy Barty for. Anyways, yeah, I just feel like this movie kind of betrayed its own audience, and I'm glad we're past the stage where that was possible. I don't think something like Masters of the Universe could happen now. I think a Masters of the Universe movie can and will come out, and I don't know whether it's going to be any good or not, but it's not going to be as bad as this because this movie exists as a shining beacon of what not to do. Now, that being said, there's more to like than there is in Superman 4. There were some really creative elements to it. Langella really does nail it as Skeletor, even though he's different than the series. But I think he is proof that we would have accepted something different from the series had the difference at least been good. I think the difference in Skeletor was at least good. Other than that,
again, I will say at the time as a kid, I was like, "That's not Skeletor. Why isn't he purple? Why is this skull?" But as an adult, I would go, "Oh, well, like it's actually a very well done costume and makeup design. Langella is amazing because he's fucking Frank Langella, and he's you can tell that he bought into it, which is always really important for those kind of movies. But it is one of the things they are doing a movie, and I say this because I'm one of them. But the most awful people in the world are middle-aged nerds who grew up with something because sometimes they can't divorce themselves or distance themselves from their nostalgia of it.
Yes.
So people are shitting on it even though it hasn't been made. But, I will wait and see.
Yeah, I'll give it a shot.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. The kid who's playing him, I'm like, that was weird casting. But again,
but it's not made for me. I'll have to watch it objectively and see what it was. But this one, the canon one, was made for me, and I saw it in the theater. The same year that I saw Superman 4. Actually, I think I liked Superman 4 better in hindsight back then. It's switched a little now. But I saw them both at the same theater. My dad took me to go see it at that one in San Bernardino that eventually became a Video Mart.
Oh, yeah.
It used to be one really big screen theater. And I saw, like I said, this in Superman 4 the same year at that theater. And I remember being about 8 years old and having it be one of the first things that I knew that something wasn't right about it. I still loved it because I was a kid and my dad took me out to the movies. I wasn't going to tell my dad I didn't like the movie that he took me to.
Yeah.
But there was a part of me that felt a little cheated even at that age. Like, well, geez, why didn't we get Orko? Because he's a major part of the story. Why did we get this little thing that drinks barbecue sauce? And why are they vegetarians on Eternia?
Yeah.
There's nothing in the cartoon about them being vegetarians. Now I'm nitpicking on purpose, but you get my point.
Yes.
And again, I think that they could have made those decisions to make it different had they made decisions to make it better. but they didn't. They made it worse.
Well, one thing though that I feel like, there's like fan service now. We pay a lot of attention to, what fan communities demand and what, and like we, gotta please the core audience and the diehards, but that doesn't always make a good movie. Like in fact, oftentimes it doesn't.
Yeah.
And as a giant nerd and a guy who's been in different fandoms for decades, at least I'm an adult and can say like, yeah, that's not the exact translation of the source material, but this is a movie and we have to judge it as a film. And unfortunately, on both those regards, most people don't hold Master of the Universe up as a high regard. But again, I rewatch it pretty consistently. I find it fun. I like what they did. I mean, the movie had a lot of, there's a lot of production. They lost all of their money before they could film the final sequence, which was supposed to be this huge epic sword fight between Skeletor and He-Man, and they lost all the money, so they basically had everybody to work for free, and they had to cut this giant fight sequence down to a much smaller sequence, and Frank Langella had to do the fighting himself because they couldn't have a stuntman. He was in this unbelievably ornate costume at that point when Skeletor basically gets and they're fighting on wet like stone, and he's like he can barely stand up, let alone have this believable sword fight. So there's a lot of like, the movie suffered from some poor or some bad luck or whatever, but I still like it. But it was one of the final nails in the coffin. There was a lot of money spent on the rights and advertising, and it didn't do well. It blew up in their face, and it was sort of one of the nails in the coffin, so to speak.
Yes. Golan and Globus really thought that they had a firecracker here, and it blew up in their hand.
Yes.
The only thing that blew up worse for them, because they put millions of dollars into it, and there are other podcasts. There's actually another podcast called Best Movies Never Made, which they do a 4-part episode on the various versions of Spider-Man that existed before Sam Raimi ever got it.
Yep.
And at least an episode and a half, maybe even 2 full episodes, were just on Canon's version of Spider-Man. They had bought the rights for, I think it was something like it was about $250,000. So $250,000 they bought they licensed Spider-Man. Rumor has it too that Marvel at that point said, hey, for another $20,000, some really low figure, we'll throw in the rest of Marvel for you. You can make whatever you want. And Canon was like, nah, we're going to stick with Spider-Man. Obviously would have saved the company had they taken that incredible lowball offer. But no, they just took Spider-Man, and it was originally pitched as a Tobe Hooper movie in typical Canon fashion. It was in all the trades. They made posters for it. They made a mini trailer for it. And then it moved on to being a Joseph Zito film. But the Tobe Hooper version, this is just worthy of mention here. The reason why Tobe Hooper was making it was because they wanted to make a horror movie. Golan and Globus knew so little about Spider-Man as a character that they thought he was like the Wolfman. And so they were going to make a movie in which a teenager morphs into a Spider-Man. And
similar to The Fly, yes.
Yes. And so that's why it was going to be Tobe Hooper. And then when they realized Stan Lee went through the freaking ceiling when he heard about this and insisted they rewrite it. And that's when it became a Joseph Zito project. And at one point, Tom Cruise was going to be Spider-Man. Or was going to be Peter Parker. Lauren Bacall was going to be Aunt May. Bob Hoskins was going to be Dr. Octopus. And Stan Lee himself was going to be J. Jonah Jameson. And this one,
which I thought would have been great.
Yeah, it would have been. At least would have been interesting. And it never got off the ground. They, of course, had planned to do a Masters of the Universe Part 2 as well, because they had banked on this movie being their biggest movie ever. But when those two things fell through, Masters of the Universe and Spider-Man, for kind of what I would consider to be the last really well-known theatrical canon movie, they incorporated elements of the costumes and the sets of Masters of the Universe 2 and Spider-Man into the Van Damme film Cyborg, which is still called Masters of the Universe
Cyborg
2 in some listing.
Which is, I heard when I learned of that, years ago. I was a fan of the film Cyborg, the Jean-Claude Van Damme post-apocalyptic cyborg movie, geniusly called Cyborg. I still this day could not fathom how that script. I mean, it must have been one really dark sequel, but it's pretty fascinating to know that how studios will do that. They'll have a script and have to make one reason or another, have to make a decision to change it to keep making the film. And it's like you said, if you watch the movie Cyborg, I'm like, I don't know. I mean, in small ways, you're like, I guess I could see how this was going to be a sequel for Masters of the Universe, but it's a very bizarre movie. But yeah, it was the last. Didn't do well. Movie did not do well. Didn't do anything for Van Damme outside of just making sure that he was on the USA Network, every other weekend, right alongside Beastmaster. But of course, like I said, as a kid, I was a fan. In fact, the main villain in that movie still kind of freaks me out. But yeah, it was a sad demise. They really, overshot. One thing though you didn't mention is for the longest time, it wasn't rumor because he's gone on record as saying he wanted to do it, but it was actually James Cameron wanted to do Spider-Man and fought for it. He had the script.
He did. He had a scriptment, and that's covered in this podcast, The Best Movies Never Made, as well. And it goes really into detail into his scriptment. So you would have gotten an idea. His was going to be DiCaprio. And I think he was there at the end of... See, when Golan and Globus split up as partners, Golan kept canon and kept doing, American Ninja 5 and direct-to-video Chuck Norris movies and things like that. Menachem Golan went off and started a company called 21st Century. He took Spider-Man with him. And that was at that point where I believe James Cameron got involved. So James Cameron was involved in the very end of Menachem Golan's ownership of Spider-Man, but stayed on after he left and was really kind of there for the beginning of the Columbia period of Spider-Man, which still exists, the Sony Columbia period, which eventually became Sam Raimi, and then on to what it has become now, an official part of the Marvel Universe and all of this. But James Cameron's version was a lot more interesting and closer to the comic book. It was also going to be a Dr. Octopus story, I believe, and was supposed to be Leonardo DiCaprio, pre-Titanic, as our friendly neighborhood web-slinger. But Menachem was able to produce that direct-to-video version of Captain America out of this deal too. So that was probably an idea of the kind of thinking that you would have gotten on a canon Spider-Man.
Exactly, which would have been a smoking hot turd.
It's more fun to talk about how it didn't get made than it probably ever would have been to watch it.
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, if it was as bad as Captain America, it would have maybe been fun for a different. God, what a movie. But yeah, and that's the thing is, they just didn't have the budget. They couldn't really spend the money that it would take to bring those characters to life, especially at the time. But really before, where CGI has ended up and everything. So, but I think
we need a movie star for this movie. Get me Ronnie Cox. Like it's. So nothing. I like Ronnie Cox, but
yeah, exactly. I will say, there's a ton of movies we didn't get to talk about. That, probably the penitentiary movies.
Firewalker, I enjoy.
Hero on the Terror, which was my, I think at the end was one of my mom's favorite films, and I actually really like it. It's a little different from the normal Chuck Norris cop movies. It's a little different, but yeah, it's there's some other movies, but
Delta
obviously
Force and Chuck Norris on a motorcycle with rocket launchers on it,
on the sides, which is still God, that's what I'm saying. How do you again? I wouldn't want to have a single conversation with Chuck Norris, but he was my childhood. But yeah, like always, I'm sure, people out there, could say, hey, why didn't you bring up, Messenger of Death or, any other movies that, from their film library. But obviously this has already been.
We did not want part 3 Electric Boogaloo.
Yeah, exactly. So, but yeah, this was really fun, man. Like I said, this is definitely these movies on here were really important to me growing up, and still to this day. I literally watched Kickboxer 3 days ago, not because of this podcast, just because I wanted to see it. But yeah, it's definitely a thing. Like we could probably revisit, but it's funny because even outside of the films themselves, it was a really interesting history to it. Enough, like I said, that there's a separate podcast all about it. That there's a feature-length documentary about it, a book written about it.
A couple of books now.
Oh, a couple books. There you go. I stand corrected. Obviously, if you are of a certain age and you grew up with those movies, probably at least a handful of those movies met you. If you're a fan of action films and stuff, they definitely had a huge impact on that genre in the 80s. But yeah, this was fun, Devin. Hopefully the next one, the one-parter. But
yeah, let's pick something that's got a much smaller filmography attached to it. I caught to this. This was my bad. I thought it would be fun to do canon films and was not thinking about how broad. I mean, we still didn't even touch the 60s and the 70s and the direct-to-video stuff in the 90s, which actually does have a gem or two to it. But I think we wanted to focus, rightfully so, on what was really the best time for canon films, where they were really a force in the movie industry. They were something that everyone was keeping an eye on, whether they liked them or not. They had to see, well, when's the next canon film coming out? They were competitors to the major studios, the ones that they weren't partners with occasionally. So, and a genuine star maker for people like Jean-Claude Van Damme and Chuck Norris and Michael Dudikoff. Who I still say he's underrated even in this podcast.
That's right.
Dudikoff should have gotten more attention, but then again, Canon should have given him more attention. So yeah, this was great. Maybe someday when some of these things are less out of print, we can do an episode on those elite films that we talked about and get into the Cassavetes and the Altman of Canon. But for now, I think we've spoken our piece. We've said about as much as we can. And once again, if anyone wants to deep dive on these or hear about some of the movies we didn't mention, check out the Canon with Frank Garcia Hale and Jeff Garlock, a really good podcast where you can find the same places where you find us. Den of Sin on Spotify, Apple Podcast. We are now on YouTube at this point. We're picking up some steam. So you can find us anywhere that you listen to podcasts, and you can also find us on Facebook and Twitter under Den of Sin, CIN. Please do go on and correspond with us. We're getting a little lonely on our social media, I'll be honest, which is mostly my fault. I just kind of post when we have new episodes. I will promise to be more engaged with you, our fans, if you promise to be a little more engaged with us, because we would like to be a little bit more present there. Anything you'd like to close out with, James?
No, just Devin, as always, it's really it's always a pleasure to record these with you. You're a man of taste and knowledge, but most importantly, I just want to say, if you haven't seen the movie Cobra, rent it, buy it, do whatever you have to do, sell your mom's meds, watch that movie, because if you don't, I can't, I won't be able to. I feel like I was put on this earth to spread the good word, the gospel of Sylvester Stallone's Cobra. So go watch Cobra.
Agreed. I 100% agree. Cobra needs to be seen, folks. And my picks would probably be 52 Pickup and Runaway Train if you take anything from this. But
you mean the good movies?
Hey, Cobra's one of the good movies, man. I'm telling you.
I agree, obviously.
Hey, look, between Cobretti and Robert Loggia, I choose Cobretti. So it's
good. There you go. That's okay. You've redeemed yourself. Okay. I can continue to record this podcast with you now. Right. It was touch and go there, but you've redeemed yourself.
And as they apparently say in Eternia, was it Good Journey? Is that what
Good Journey to you?
Good Journey,
I believe
James.
so, yes. Good journey, Devin.
And good journey, all of you. We'll see you next time.